If the popularity of the 1995 David Fincher film Seven tells us anything, it's that even in an increasingly secular society like America, there remains a deep fascination with the idea of sin. In the film, the antagonist, known only as John Doe, leverages the 7 deadly sins as a motif to string together a series of gruesome crimes, forcing the audience to reckon with questions such as, what is sin? And how shall we respond when people sin? And though we recoil at Doe's extremism, viewers generally accept the film's premise, which is a sin is a moral failure deserving of judgment and punishment. I've been a pastor now for over 15 years, and I can assure you that this way of thinking about sin comes to us from the tradition of Christianity. And like the box at the end of the film Seven, it is perhaps a gift that was best left unopened. I was born and raised in a conservative Christian home, and the effects of thinking of sin in this way, they've been with me for as long as I can remember. When I was 10 years old, I checked out a book on magic from the library and learned a few simple tricks with a deck of cards. Coincidentally, around the same time, my younger brother and I were learning how to play blackjack, and we started using our collection of basketball cards as betting currency, to make the games a little more interesting. And much to my brother's chagrin, every time we played, I insisted on being dealer. Friends, you're not wrong for guessing where this story might be going. So my strategy was I would let him win some of the earlier rounds. For the cards I didn't really care about, let him build his confidence a little. Then when he'd put a card of real value on the line, suddenly, little sleight of hand, dealer hits 21! Ha! It's a miracle! But my newfound joy was short-lived, because then I would lay in bed later that night, terrified that God would strike me in my sleep. Because I was taught growing up that things like cheating my younger brother made God very angry, and that heaven had no interest in a sinner like me. And I thought, as good as he is, I very much doubt I could bribe old St. Peter to let me in a slide, albeit slightly less pearly gate, in exchange for my new shadily acquired Shaquille O'Neal rookie card. My religious heritage has long had this all-consuming seriousness toward sin. For many Christians, it's seen as like the defining feature of what it means to be human, that we are all sinners deserving of punishment. In fact, many Christian traditions also teach that God, who created the entire universe and who supposedly loves all creation, also, at the same time, cannot stand humans because of sin. Hence my occasional sleepless nights growing up, terrified that I'd swindled my brother one too many times. This fear of offending a perfect God has long been leveraged by religion to control and manipulate the masses. And that's bad enough, of course, but a deeper impact of thinking of sin in this way is how it causes us to internalize a sense of disgust. For if we really are nothing more than immoral beings who are unworthy of love, then of course we would possess this sense of self-hatred or shame. And quite naturally, we would then project this hyper-judgmentalism onto others for their sinful ways. And you have shame and judgment, this water that so many of us seem to be swimming in. I say this because I think we need to reimagine how we think about sin, because it's destroying ourselves and each other. And to do that, I want to dust off this forgotten tradition of where the idea of sin even came from, because sometimes the traditions of the past are our best hope for illuminating a new path forward today. In ancient Greece, Aristotle did a lot of thinking about what made a story a tragedy, and he concluded that a tragedy is when an otherwise good and noble character experienced this massive reversal in fortune, where instead of a trajectory of well-being, now they're on a trajectory of loss and sorrow. And this reversal in fortune evoked a sense of pity from the audience, which led to a state of catharsis, or this release of tension and anxiety. And the thing that caused the change in the character's course, the catalyst for their reversal in fortune, was known as hamartia. This Greek word, hamartia, it comes from the world of archery, and literally it means to miss the mark, that your arrow missed the mark of the target that you were aiming at. But it also came to have a metaphorical meaning of missing the mark. Similar to how today we might use sports terminology, like from the world of baseball, we might say that Bob from accounting really whiffed on his presentation this afternoon, by which we mean that he swung and he missed, or just that he didn't do a good job. In Greek tragedies, then, the main character would miss the mark. They would hamartia and catalyze then this tragic reversal in their fortune. Here's an example. One of the most well-known Greek tragedies is Oedipus Rex from Sophocles. And in this whodunit murder mystery filled with mistaken identity and accidental incest, the audience is privy to all the important information that those who are in the play are blind to, such as how Oedipus, in his effort to outsmart fate, inadvertently killed his own father and married his own mother. And at the end of the play, when all is revealed and all the facts come to light, the play ends with death and suffering and exile and sorrow, a true tragedy in every sense of the word. And for Aristotle, this epitomized tragedy because the audience is watching in horror as Oedipus' life experiences this massive reversal in fortune, as his life deteriorates from one of success and happiness to one of deep pain and unimaginable loss. And everything changed for Oedipus when he missed the mark, when he hamartiaed. So what was his hamartia? In what way did he miss the mark? Well, first, it's important to point out that the thing about hamartia, when someone missed the mark, it wasn't because they had a flaw in their character, that they were a bad person. No, it was seen as an error in their judgment. But more to the point, this error in judgment wasn't because they were a bad person. This error in judgment was because they had gaps in their knowledge. In other words, in ignorance, they missed the mark. You don't commit hamartia because you're just a really bad marksman who needs to try harder and do better next time. No, the point is that you miss the mark because maybe no one ever taught you how to plant your feet. Maybe no one ever showed you the right way to notch an arrow, to pull back your bow. Maybe you never learned how to pace your breathing. And because of these gaps in your knowledge, your arrow doesn't fly true. Oedipus was a good and noble man. And when he pulled back the bow of his life, he aimed at targets such as peace and justice. However, he missed with tragic consequences. But he missed because he had these massive gaps in his knowledge. For had Oedipus known the truth of his parents' identity, or even more precisely, had he known the truth about his own identity, then he never would have missed the mark by killing his own father and marrying his own mother. And this is what makes the story so tragic. Now, I think to the detriment of our culture today, this idea of hamartia has all but been forgotten. And in large part, this is thanks actually to the Bible. And why is that? Well, because in the Bible, this word hamartia shows up almost 500 times. And in nearly every instance that hamartia shows up, the English word that translators use to bring hamartia into our world is the word sin. In other words, what these ancient spiritual teachers were calling hamartia, we are now calling sin. But these are not the same things. For hamartia implies that people are basically good, and when they miss the mark, it's because they have gaps in their knowledge. And in ancient Greece, the appropriate response to hamartia was compassion. Sin, on the other hand, suggests that people are fundamentally bad. And when we miss the mark, it's because we're morally corrupt. And the appropriate response to sin is condemnation. A number of years ago, I was on staff at a church, actually not too far from here. And I was fired rather unexpectedly one afternoon when my bosses learned that my beliefs now include support for the full inclusion of LGBTQ people in the church, a position which, sadly, most churches throughout history have opposed. And so left with no job and no community, my wife and our 3.5 sons at the time were forced to sell the home that we had built and move back to our hometown in Oregon to try to put our lives back together. Now, it would be easy to look back on that time in my life at that tragic event and those men who fired me with anger, indignation, and feel like they were wrong for what they did. And certainly when it first happened, that was how I felt. But as time has passed and as the pain has lessened, I feel like I can see it a little more clearly for what it was, which was good men committing hamartia. Because I believe that their ideas about God were underdeveloped, and their understanding of LGBTQ people was just wrong. And it was these gaps in their knowledge that led them to fire a pastor who had served there faithfully for 5 years. Our culture, as I see it, is drowning in shame and judgment. And it might just be that choosing to believe that when people sin, when they miss the mark, choosing to believe that it is because they have gaps in their knowledge rather than they are bad people and have flaws in their character, this might just be the way that we start to heal our fractured world. Because it helps to restore both our own and each other's fundamental goodness. Condemnation, judgment, these don't provide paths to peace. These can't lift the weights of shame. We will only further reinforce the divides that separate us the more that we see ourselves and each other as nothing more than immoral beings unworthy of love, instead of, finite humans who maybe just never learned how to plant our feet, never had anyone show us how to pull back a bow or pace our breathing. In the cosmic play that is the story of human history, I don't know what kind of story we're telling yet. On our current course, where we seem determined to see the worst in ourselves and each other, where we call out and cancel others, where we cast our stones of judgment, maybe we're in the midst of a tragedy. And if that's the case, I can imagine future generations doing an autopsy to see what went wrong, what caused our reversal in fortune. And they might discover that our culture's great hamartia was when we traded in compassion for missing the mark and instead chose condemnation. But if we return to its roots and we dust off this forgotten tradition of hamartia, we can rethink our ideas of sin, and this can change everything. One of my sons right now is 10 years old, and he also occasionally will swindle his younger brother, although this time it's with Pokemon cards instead of basketball. And maybe this is what's meant by the whole sins of the father being passed on. I don't know. But when this happens, I don't tell him that he's a sinner who's made God angry. No, I try to remind him of who I think he really is. Call him back to his true identity, that you are a good, kind peacemaker. I invite him to consider what it might feel like if his older brothers did the same to him. And I say to him, hey buddy, can you imagine what it would be like if your younger brother knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he could always trust you? I think by extending compassion to him in these moments when he misses the mark will help ensure that as he grows older, more of his arrows will fly true. Maya Angelou said, I did then what I knew how to do. And now that I know better, I do better. Maybe we're all just 10-year-olds fumbling through the world, doing the best we can with what we have, with what we know. And such is the gift of hamartia, that when we know better, when we fill in the gaps in our knowledge both about ourselves and one another, then we truly can do better. Thank you.